Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's Friday, June 28th. Starliner is still in space at the space station, and it is time for some more deep space updates. And so, going back to the 19th of June, we'll start with the rocket launches and a Falcon 9 launching Starlink Group 9-1. Finally, this was from Vandenberg. It was delayed by a week, but eventually went off. 20th of June, we had Electron from Rocket Lab with their 50th launch. No Time to Lose from Mahia. So this is 5 Internet of Things satellites launching into a 635-kilometer sun-synchronous orbit. This is a French company called Kinéis. And this is the 50th launch. And of course, Rocket Lab made a lot of PR about the fact that they got to 50 launches in less time than it took SpaceX. That's 7 years and 1 month versus 7 years and 9 months. But to be fair, Rocket Lab did have more failures. They had 4 failures, and also one of those was a suborbital launch. Nevertheless, congratulations to Rocket Lab. I hope you continue to have awesome and cool names, and I hope that we get to see some neutron flight stuff soon. 20th of June, Falcon 9 carried Europe's Astra 1P, or SES-44, 24 satellite, into geostationary orbit. This is a 5-ton GEO communications television satellite that sits at the 19.2 degree east section. So this is a slot that's been in use for a very long time, going back to like the first Astra satellite, which of course started Sky Television in Europe. 22nd of June, we have a Long March 2C launching out of Xichang in China. And this was carrying 2 payloads, the SVOM, right, Space Variable Objects Monitor, and Catch 1. And interestingly, one of the extended boosters was caught on camera by someone downrange watching it descend over a terrain near a village. And more interestingly, we have a bunch of local people in the foreground, visibly worried and running away from this booster as it falls from the sky, trailing an orange cloud full of nasty, toxic, hypergolic propellants. But yeah, I really wonder how the international partners on SVOM consider, because this is a mission to study to study gamma ray bursts. And it's done in collaboration with the French space agency, CNES. This is basically, it's an X-ray gamma ray telescope that is going to be able to respond to these gamma ray burst events, which come out at random points in the sky. And for a few seconds, they emit more energy than the sun emits in its entire life. These are very bright events a long way away, and we still don't truly understand what's going on here. So this is a spacecraft to actually study these and watch how the light curves and various spectral changes over time. Moving onwards, we get to June 23rd. There's a Starlink launch, 10-2 out of Slick 40, carrying 22 satellites. 24th of June was yet another boring Starlink, launch 9-2 out of Vandenberg. But for this one, I knew it was going to be launching about 10 minutes after sunset. I got up in my little plane with a friend. I flew south about 100 miles to get a better view. It was just a really cool thing to try and do. It wasn't that much closer. It was like 100 of 250 miles. It was still definitely small and on the horizon, but it was a fantastic fun flight, and I have a whole video about that. 25th of June, Falcon Heavy performing a launch of GOES-U. This was an RTLS launch where the 2 boosters were recovered at the launch site in spectacular style as usual. There was some really awesome shockwaves that some people call images of. Now, GOES-U is going to become GOES-19. So the GOES series, they're the geostationary Earth observation satellites. They built 4 of them in this batch, starting out with GOES-R. And there's 2 on each coast. I think this is going to the east coast position, and it will eventually replace GOES-16, which is currently sitting out there. GOES-16 will remain in orbit as a potential backup if there's a problem. So they have these very high quality weather satellites sitting in geostationary orbit. You check out the data that they produce. It's pretty amazing. This also, this is, by the way, was the first launch of a GOES satellite by SpaceX. This terrestrial weather satellite also includes a coronagraph instrument, which will be used to study the solar corona and provide essentially solar weather updates, which sometimes can be pretty important. Also, around the same time this was launched, NOAA announced that Lockheed had got the contract for the next generation of satellites, the GeoXO. Those are going to be launching in the 2030s. 27th of June, final launch, we have another Starlink 10-3 out of Slick 40 on the East Coast. In this time, there was also one other suborbital launch that I want to mention, and that is 18th of June out of Vandenberg. There was a surprise launch of a Minotaur, which is a rocket based upon the Minuteman, and it was carrying a test re-entry vehicle for the US's future LGM-35 Sentinel, right, which is going to be the US's replacement for the Minuteman III. This is a program started, under Obama to basically modernize all the legs of the nuclear triad, I believe is the technical term they use. Anyway, as I alluded to right at the start, for the last few weeks, there's been lots of stories about Starliner hanging out on space station, right? And so yes, there are multiple helium leaks, and they have been trying to understand those and see if they can collect data. The return dates were repeatedly pushed back until June the 26th return date was cancelled with no future return date. Now, the spacecraft can remain on station for something like up to 45 days in its current configuration, but a lot of clickbaity style news stories came out saying, astronauts are stuck on the space station. Oh no, they might need rescued. Okay, so yes, they might need rescued if everything fails, but then again, SpaceX's Dragon people might need rescued if everything fails. You see how easy that is? Look, as far as I've not talked to anyone in the know that seems to think that this is going to be a problem for returning. They have one questionable thruster out of 18. They have backups for a reason. And these thrusters are all in the service module. They are jettisoned after re-entry, which is one of the reasons why they want to test this stuff out on orbit, because it's going to burn up in the atmosphere on the way down. Now, to get an idea of just how much the astronauts are prepared to rely on Starliner, they were sheltering it in it yesterday. So there was an old Russian satellite called Resurs P1. It launched in 2013 and had shut down operations in 2021, and a debris generating event was observed, i.e. the thing exploded or fell apart or something. It's really early on, but hundreds of fragments were detected from this object. And since this was early and they were still analyzing the trajectories of these things, the crew on the space station were ordered to shelter in their return spacecraft. The idea is that if the space station is hit and it's stricken and they have to get home, they are already in the spacecraft and they are already ready to go. They've done their pre-flight checklist. They know that they can just, they probably might even have closed the hatch, but they're ready to get out of here. And yeah, so crew were in Starliner, Dragon, and Soyuz ready to return, but as of right now, looks like it wasn't needed. We don't know why this satellite failed in this way. It was shut down in 2021. It could be that they just simply didn't vent the fuel tanks properly and then some piece of hardware finally broke and something exploded, or it might have been hit by something that was small and invisible, but we actually are pretty good at tracking hardware at that altitude. Anyway, China made history by Chang'e's return capsule coming back from the moon. It performed a skip re-entry over the Atlantic and flew over Asia and eventually landed out in Inner Mongolia. So we know now that it has returned 1,935.3 grams of samples, which is slightly short of the 2 kilograms, but this is the first samples from the far side of the moon. And, this may help us understand why there is such obvious geographical differences between the far side of the moon and the near side of the moon. The near side is all like lava fields and the far side is all craters. So this has been returned. We'll see what happens. The Chang'e spacecraft that brought it back from the moon, the ferry, the service module, it didn't follow the capsule into the atmosphere. It performed a diversion burn, swung around the Earth. It's heading back out into space. China did a lot of stuff with Chang'e 5, putting it into new orbits, like a distant retrograde orbit. They probably have plans for Chang'e 6 service module. And also, China performed a new, bigger test of a reusable rocket booster. Now, this is analogous to SpaceX's Grasshopper, where they flew it up. This is like a 3.8 meter wide booster running 3 liquid methane oxygen engines. It lifted off, it flew to 12 kilometers, and then it descended back down and landed. Now, at this point, it wasn't going to be moving fast enough that it needed to use aerodynamics. It didn't have any grid fins or something to descend down quickly. This was closer to what DCX did in the 1990s, or what SpaceX did over at McGregor. Just up and just down. Now, this is of course showing that they have the controllability to put this down in one place, and they will have bigger plans going forwards. I understand that they want to do a suborbital flight to 70 kilometers, which will include grid fins, but they're getting there. They're still figuring this out. While, of course, Europe is still telling the world that, no, we don't think this reusability thing is going to catch on, and the Ariane 6 is fine for them. Yes, they literally said that this week. Now, also speaking about reusability, Starship has been putting an old test tank on their big launch stand, and they've been trying to see how quickly they can move their little chopsticks in and out and hook it up. So it looks more like they're spanking their booster, sort of their tank. Bad tank, you failed testing. No, they've been doing this just to verify and tune their gains, because obviously, when you're trying to catch a booster that is sitting on a rocket, flame, like every second is critical, and they need to be able to do this quickly, but without smashing up the sides of it. And it'll become even harder when they try and do the same thing on a Starship, which is covered in tiles. And speaking of tiles, SpaceX have been removing all the tiles off of the next Starship in line and replacing them with some new mechanism. Now, it sounds, what I understand, they're going to be still using the same kind of tiles on the surface, but they're now adding an ablative material underneath, which will protect the surface should one of the tiles fall off. It's not really clear exactly what the nature of this material is, but I guess we're going to get to see it working at some point in the future. Firefly had a bunch of news in the last few days. They're about to launch a NASA mission out of Vandenberg in the next few days. But they announced 2 new launch sites. Now, the first of these is going to be Wallops, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport. And this isn't surprising because, of course, they're building the replacement for Antares, which will be launched from Wallops. It seems only natural that they will be able to launch their Alpha from there and potentially their medium launch vehicle, maybe even from the same stand as Antares. But more surprisingly, Firefly have now secured an agreement to launch Alpha from Sweden, from the S-Range facility, which has basically been doing sounding rocket launches for decades. Now they're going to be hopefully launching full-size orbital rockets out of there. And that will be a second potential launch site in Europe. That could start as soon as 2026. The other potential launch site in Europe is currently Saxevord Spaceport in the Shetland Islands, and Rocket Factory Alsberg just posted some images saying that they've now, having tested their test booster with 5 engines on it, they've now put 9 Helix engines on, and they're going to be going for full power tests in the coming weeks and possibly launching by the end of the year. So great progress on that. But elsewhere, there has been quite a bit of a step back. Collins Aerospace is basically de-scoping suit development. That is, they are cancelling their spacesuit development project. Now, they were supposed to be developing the replacement Exploration EVA services, the EVAS, I don't know, whatever. This is unfortunate, right? Because Collins Aerospace and Axiom were supposed to be the 2 companies developing these, and now they've decided that they can't actually do it and have asked to be dropped. It's not really clear what's going on. And this also has come around the same time that a planned EVA from the space station has been cancelled twice due to problems with the suits. These are 40-year-old space suits that have been operating since the early days of the space shuttle, and they haven't been upgraded. One person on Twitter was immediately saying, well, they should just hand this project to the same people that built the shuttle and the Apollo suits, which, by the way, is ILC Dover, which is Collins Aerospace. Now, the other suit partner, Axiom, they are primarily working on the lunar EVA suits, the ones that will have the astronauts walking around. So it's possibly easier for them to adapt their suits into the full EVA suits. That is most likely solution. It sounds like Axiom has been having a little bit of a hard time getting investors interested in supporting this project. So having fewer competitors is probably bad for NASA, but better for Axiom because they'll be able to get all the contracts. The other option is, of course, SpaceX, who are about to fly somebody in their EVA suit, although their EVA suit is a lot less ambitious than what NASA has been used to operating with, but it may be useful in a pinch. The other really sobering news about human spaceflight is that SpaceX are going to destroy the International Space Station. That's it. Yeah, they have got a contract for $843 million to build the Deorbit vehicle. This will launch up to the space station around 2030, and at the appropriate time, it will light its engines and slow the space station down until it falls into the Earth's atmosphere over the Pacific, safely for the Earth, not so safe for the International Space Station. This will be, the space station had limited life because the materials, they go through this thermal cycling, like every 90 minutes they're getting heated and cooled, and that causes problems. There's materials that are not, they're constantly being subjected to atomic oxygen. So NASA decided they put a life limit on the space station, and 2030 is it for now. Now, I would really like to see the space station boosted to a higher orbit so that it could be saved for future generations. NASA has actually responded with a fairly substantial white paper explaining their decisions and how they explored other options. They couldn't find any commercial partners who would be willing to take on the full maintenance of the space station after 2030. For raising the space station to a higher orbit, they point out that as you go higher up, you get more and more space debris because at the altitude the space station is at, there is enough drag that small pieces of debris get deorbited in a relatively short timescale. But higher up, there's a lot more small objects that could potentially hit the space station. And the time between impacts that could potentially penetrate station hardware drops to as low as 4 years once you're up to about 800 kilometers. Obviously, going up higher than that will take much, much more fuel. That's why they want to go with the cheaper option, because apparently the taxpayer wants to pay less money for destroying $1 trillion thing rather than spend a little more money to save $1 trillion thing. The third piece of news, which isn't quite as bad as the other two, is that Dreamchaser isn't on schedule and is not going to fly on the second launch of Vulcan. So it was originally going to be the second certification payload for Vulcan so it could get on and do, flights of its national security payloads. At this point, it's running too late, and so they're going to replace Dreamchaser with a mass simulator, which they had originally developed to fly instead the Astrobotic lander didn't get on there. So that's what's going to fly. I hope they do something interesting with it. I've suggested that they should put one of Tory Bruno's like cowboy hat hard hats on there with a camera on it. That would be cool. Come on, you know you guys want to be cool. But yeah, ULA at this point, they really need to move forward with Vulcan, and they can't afford to wait for Sierra Space. Once they do that, and assuming it's a success, then they can move forward with the real customers, the US Space Force. So they've got two payloads they'd like to fly before the end of the year, USSF 106 and 87. And once those are out the way, then the next Vulcan will be available for Dreamchaser. So we're looking at next year now for Dreamchaser flying on its demonstration mission to the International Space Station. And so finally, this weekend is Asteroid Day, June 30th. It's an event that I've been involved with since its inception 9 years ago. I'm going to be giving a presentation at Chabot Space and Science Center with a bunch of astronauts in attendance. NASA, they performed another asteroid impact hazard exercise where they get a bunch of experts together and they play out like a war game. This time they had an asteroid which they found, but it had like a 75% chance of hitting in 2038, but then it was going away from the Earth and they had to sort of play out, do we really spend a lot of resources and do this, or do we wait until later and then be sure before we start causing a panic? There were UN people involved because, of course, they want to be able to communicate a global hazard to a global audience. Yeah, that was a whole interesting thing they talked about, but Perhaps the more interesting thing is that OSIRIS-REx has released some of their first papers. They analysed one particular batch of minerals and they found that it was primarily made of clay minerals, and they found phosphates. So what these say is that all these things are kind of form in water-rich environments. So Bennu originally was part of some body that had liquid water in sufficient quantities that it could deposit sediments and allow these chemical reactions to produce these phosphates. It could have been part of a proto-ocean world which was then subsequently broken up. We don't really know. This is going to be something that's going to be investigated from the various samples, but it's cool that we actually get to see some of the data coming out of this at this time of year. I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.